you.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to this Country Navigator Masterclass. My name's Andy Bruff, and it's my pleasure and privilege to take you through the next 60 minutes talking about a subject that's fascinated me for the best part of almost 3 decades now, the notion of leadership and particularly global leadership, and more specifically our title today, which is Developing Your Global Mindset. What I want to find out from you is really, how do you see leadership? And what I want to understand is whether you see leadership as being more innate or learned. And that's probably a good place for us to start. We'll ask you to contribute in chat. And Luke, if you can just advance to the next slide for us. What are your thoughts? Is leadership innate or learned? Let's start with that one. And then we'll go on to the universal or cultural. And you could just advance both of those for us, please, Luke. It's really important, I think, to understand these questions, because these are questions that I'm often asked. Can a leader be developed, or is it something that you're just born with? Is it something that is up to the environment that you work in, or are there things that we have as an advantage just in terms of genetics? I think it's really interesting to see that some of you are saying it's learned. Some of you are saying it's both. Dinesh talks about the fact that it's mostly environmental. And I think certainly as I think about this question, the answer that I now give to colleagues that I work with around the world is, people ask, are leaders born or are they made? And my answer is they're born to be made. It's no doubt that the leadership competencies are things that some people just seem to have an advantage on. We see that in the playground very early on with toddlers. But if I didn't believe that leadership was something that was learned, then I wouldn't have been able to embark on the career that I have, that's taken me around the world with leaders in more than 100 countries now. So I agree with Luca. It's both, but we can learn and we can improve. I think the second thing then is, what about this notion of leadership being universal or cultural? At Country Navigator, we're really passionate about this notion of developing your cultural quotient, this idea that cultural intelligence is important. But would you say that leadership is something that's universally applicable, or does it only work in certain cultural contexts? So if you want to just drop a U or a C into chat, or the full words, as you may have done with the innate or learned, give me your thoughts. Thanks, Mimi. So Mimi's saying it's universal. Some of you are saying cultural. And I think we've got a pretty good mix there. Again, it's an interesting question. The research shows us clearly now that there are universally applicable leadership competencies. They translate language, they translate culture, and they are going to work in most contexts. However, as Dinesh says, the expression of those leadership competencies requires a degree not just of emotional intelligence, but also of cultural intelligence. And part of what we're going to look at today is this notion of the global mindset on the back of a really strong cultural intelligence approach. And so when we look at cultural intelligence, it's important to ask ourselves, what do we mean by that? Well, before we get into that, let me ask Luke to share with us a link, which he will place into chat. And you can click on that. And when you do, you will then be given the option. Don't worry about names and email addresses. There is an option, I believe it's a red button at the bottom, which just says enter as a visitor. And if you do that, it will take you into our mural link where you can participate. Imagine that this is a digital flip chart, a digital whiteboard, if you like, that we're all working on together. So I'm going to ask Luke to go ahead and give us the view from his screen of that mural. And we should be able to see people coming in now. And what I want you to see here is we've got 2 groups of sticky notes. The question is, what do you expect from your leader when it comes to them building trust and credibility? I'm not precious about which side of the mural you answer on. If you want to put all the answers onto one side, or you want to use multiple boxes. But really the question is, if you're following and working with and collaborating with a leader, and you're expecting that leader to be somebody who is trustworthy and credible, then what are the things that you expect them to do? How do they show up? How do they display this leadership in a way that is earning of trust, worthy of trust, and is credible? This is a question that I've been fascinated by for many, many years. And as we get into the qualitative analysis now, what's so interesting as you are entering your thoughts, and by the way, you can just click on the sticky note and that double click, it should give you the option to type in the box. And if you find that somebody else has got to the box first, no problem. And I'm sure if we need to, Luke can add some extra boxes for us as well. But I'm going to give you a couple of moments just to consider this question. You are working with a leader, you are collaborating with a leader, and you're expecting this leader to be somebody who builds trust into the way they lead, somebody who is credible in the way they lead. What does that look like? And again, you can see some of these answers coming through thick and fast. So take your time, and we'll do a quick summary in just a moment. So as I'm scanning across this wonderful mural whiteboard, I'm seeing a number of people talking about transparency. In fact, more than a number. I'm seeing references to honesty coming through a lot. I'm seeing humility. I'm seeing somebody who is really clear in their communication, who is creating an environment of psychological safety where mistakes are seen as a learning experience. I'm seeing reference to suggestions that this is a leader who is accountable for their actions and involves the team in important decisions. I'm seeing reference to a leader who's vulnerable and who leads by example and does what they say they will do, and so is consistent and predictable. And it should be no surprise to you as I ask people like yourselves around the world this question, time and time again. It's these examples of accountability, transparency, integrity that come out way higher than anything else we might talk about. Yes, there's reference to being subject matter experts, there's reference to being well experienced and well versed, but if we're talking about leadership specifically, the question of authenticity, the question of accountability, the question of honesty is really important. And I'm now at the place in my own work as an executive coach where I'm of the firm belief that this leadership requires two wings. On the one hand, it's a leader who is results focused, who is looking to move the needle in terms of taking people with them on a journey to achieve a particular outcome that is measurable and demonstrable. But on the other side, this leader also has this other wing of being incredibly focused and empathetic on people and on people's needs and skills and requirements. And to me, that ultimately represents this picture, which is backed up now by a significant amount of data, that when we're talking about leaders that we want to work with who are both trustworthy and credible, this is what we're looking for. So thank you so much to all of you for this focus. The beauty of this example is that Luke can capture this and we'll be able to send this out to you as a summary document at the end. Also want to call out that somebody has mentioned that this is a leader who's values driven. And when we link that back to the global mindset, I think that's something that's going to be really important. So having looked at that, let's now move into a discussion of a little bit more detail. If we go to the next slide there, Luke, what I want you to see is that there is this opportunity to understand cultural perspectives slightly differently. Now, for those of you who've worked with our world prism, you'll know that it is made up of 9 dimensions. The first 3 have to do with relating. The second three have to do with regulating, and the third three have to do with reasoning. What we've done here is we've given you a snapshot of three that talk very specifically to areas that are a challenge in developing a global mindset as a leader. And if we take these systematically, the first one that I want you to see is that there's this polarity between a leader that is heavily task-oriented. So by that, I mean somebody who's focused on outcomes, focused on execution, focused on deliverables, is not as easily enamored by building the social cohesion, and can often be seen as somebody who might be a little bit more standoffish and very results focused. And on the other extreme is somebody who wants to take the time to get to know you, to build that social cohesion, is very relationship focused. Now, when we look at the data from Country Navigator and the World Prism, without falling into the trap of stereotypes, we can now say with absolute certainty that there are tendencies, and these tendencies can be linked to national cultures. Of course, we're not suggesting that everybody from a particular country is going to have exactly the same profile, but we now have the data very confidently that says it is likely that if you're working with somebody from a particular country, they're going to be more or less task-orientated or more or less relationship-orientated. But that aside, even when you're working with leaders within your own team, it would be important to understand where you fall on that polarity. And I also want to say this, there's no good or bad cultural profile, there's just different. And so recognizing if I'm very relationship oriented and Luke is very task oriented or vice versa, if we know that about ourselves, then learning some of the strategies, which we'll talk about later, becomes important in terms of how we are more effective in our collaboration. That middle dimension there is around decision making. If you are part of a culture which is very hierarchical, in some cases even patriarchal, where decisions are escalated to a higher level of authority, what you've got is a concentrated decision-making governance. And typically the culture there is to escalate any decision up to a higher level of seniority. Now, if you're not familiar or comfortable with that, and you're used to something much more to the left, a flatter, consensus-based, participative type decision-making process, more shared, then immediately in your global leadership, there's going to be a challenge. And again, as I say, we've got the data now to show that there are clear tendencies, both in companies and across geographies. So being aware of that, that even though you may be more participative, you may be more collaborative in decision-making, if the people you're working with identify you as the leader and their expectation is that you are the one who has the authority, it will be important to clarify that, and vice versa. And then the third dimension you see there is individual versus group or collective. We know that some cultures reason from we to I, they reason from the whole to the part, and other cultures are much more individualistic. They're reasoning from the part, from the individual, back to the whole. And again, there are perceptions that these two extremes will have of each other. These are often stereotypical, they're often negative, but it's important to recognize, if you're part of an individual cultural approach, that there may need to be a much more participative round robin. I'm thinking of a meeting as somebody who is used to a more individualistic style of decision making. I'll come in with a very strong agenda. I'll come in with an identification of what needs to be discussed. And suddenly in a more collective setting, we'll go off topic, but everybody in that meeting will have a chance to speak. I might come out feeling somewhat frustrated by that. The people in the group have said to me many times, Andy, what a great meeting, because we all got a chance to tell each other how we were feeling. So again, understanding these different cultural perspectives, I think is important. Now, have you ever been in a situation where you were stressed or lost or confused due to some of these cultural differences. I wonder if you want to just pop some examples for us into chat, whether maybe you look at these dimensions and you say, I can relate to this. I've been in situations where I've been working cross-culturally, I've been working globally, and these differences in approach on relationship, on decision-making, on how we actually regulate are clearly some of the underlying tensions that have contributed to me feeling somewhat stressed, somewhat lost, somewhat confused. If that's you, once you share a couple of bullet points with us in chat, and we'll come back to that in just a moment. I think it's really helpful to understand that. So Jessica says, I can't understand the words being said. It caused me to be stressed. So this is a communication piece. It could be that you were working with a second language, Jessica, I don't know. It could have been that people were using terminology that you weren't familiar with, and that could be creating a huge stress for you as you work globally. So if anybody else has some examples, again, we're not trying to suggest that there's an ideal profile. We're not suggesting that being more task-oriented is better than being more relationship-oriented or vice versa. We're simply saying that the world prism shows us these dimensions. And when you understand the nuances and you're working with people, this can be so helpful. John, thank you for your example of working with a funding agency and in a more junior position and having to report to an organizational leader that was very senior. It's a great example of that shared versus concentrated. Althea talks about currently working with someone who automatically escalates decisions rather than collaborating. Again, a good example of that shared versus concentrated. And Stacey talks about heated exchanges during a meeting, which were acceptable in the culture that you were visiting, Stacey. And again, that's something we haven't necessarily alluded to here, is the dimension of implicit versus explicit. And we've got some wonderful examples of clients around the world who can relate, Stacey. Some people who've come from a very implied culture, now being repatriated or working in another country that's much more explicit, where talking it out and wearing your heart on your sleeves is par for the course. And if you're not used to that, it can be quite an adjustment. Julian talks about being in a team that's very task-oriented. Dinesh talks about the peer perception challenge, making grammatical mistakes while speaking a foreign language could be perceived as not being so competent. Thank you to those of you who've also added your thoughts there. Sneha, working well in one culture doesn't work in the other, and that's why we need to tweak our approach. Absolutely, we'll get into that in a minute. And Stephen talks about dealing with Japanese companies where there's a much more implicit approach to communication, and you have to interpret and read between the lines. Some great examples. Thank you so much for that. Okay, so let's swing into our next piece. And I'm going to ask Luke to again share with you our second mural activity. This is an interesting one because here we're now thinking about moving from not just the question of universal to innate, not just thinking about learned versus innate or universal versus culturally specific. We're going to get into some of the more detailed part of this now. So Luke, if you can go ahead and swing into showing us your screen, and we'll just ask people to really think about the differences now. So as a leader, what would be some of the critical differences that you would need to display between having a, quote, local mindset versus a global mindset? And as I work with companies around the world now who have transitioned to matrix, who have transitioned to hybrid, who have offices around the world, this is one of the challenges that they have, is how to think global but act local. And maybe we can unpack what some of those differences in mindset might look like. So local mindset on the left, global mindset on the right, and we'll give you a couple of minutes to share your thoughts. Again, if you're not sure, just click on one of the orange text boxes, the sticky notes, double click in there, and you should be able to type automatically. If you have a problem, you can just send us a message in chat and Luke will be able to help you. If we run out of sticky notes, Luke will create some more for us as well. The differences between a local and a global mindset. And isn't it interesting? Immediately, my eyes are drawn on the global mindset to words like flexibility, big picture, adaptability, openness, freedom. Not to say that these are things we wouldn't be using in a local context, but when you go and look at the left, you see policy, you see guideline, you see much clearer communication, you see expertise, you see a more singular perspective. This is really helpful, team. So let me give you a few more moments as we're now up to 96 of you. Welcome to our masterclass on developing a global mindset. And again, the inputs are very, very significant. Intercultural mindset is what's required globally. Big picture, change management, continuous learning, personal and professional boundaries, the ability to have an open mind. And I think for many of us, this is the challenge in moving from left to right, is often we have developed and crafted a career that is successful in its advocacy for those local and unique requirements, and being able to let go of some of that as you embrace the uncertainty of the global mindset is often not easy. So we'll give you another minute on this one, and then we're going to show you a couple of important resources, not the least of which are some of our videos around global mindset. Another 30 seconds. All right, you may still be busy with that. That's fine. I'm going to ask Luke to swing out of this view back to the deck. And let me share with you some principles now. There's a couple of frameworks we want you to go away with today. This first one is simple, certainly not simplistic, and incredibly profound in its ability to unpack what we mean as a framework by this notion of cultural intelligence. And certainly as somebody who's worked with Country Navigator for almost 20 years now, I can attest to the fact that these are things that, although you might know in principle, practicing and applying them, particularly when you're in a different global context, becomes really important. So let's work around the clock, if you like, starting at the top with attitude. A global mindset requires an attitude of openness, an attitude of curiosity, an attitude of flexibility. Many of the things that you spoke about in the previous mural, I would place into the attitude piece. This is prior to skills. It's about mindset. It's about a willingness to let go of what you regard as previously held assumptions. It's also a recognition that you may well still have unconscious biases that are going to potentially trip you up as you move into this global context. And there is the awareness. The awareness is moving that unconscious bias from the unconscious to the conscious. Awareness of your own stereotypes, awareness of your own prejudgments, awareness of your own limits of the world, that the worldview that you have is not necessarily going to be one that everybody else in this global context holds. And awareness too of the need to be humble, of being willing to learn, and of being willing to be wrong, particularly when you are presented with situations and contexts that you're not familiar with. But having started with the attitude and awareness, it's important then to develop the knowledge. And this is why the Country Navigator tool was first developed. And we now have more than 1 million users using the World Prism, because there is this tacit acknowledgement that not only are there these 9 dimensions of culture, but there are multiple permutations along those 9 dimensions, because we do not negotiate or interact or sell to a culture. We negotiate with and interact with individuals. And so learning about the cultural specificities and nuances is really important. John's asked a great question. John would be interested to know what percentage of participants have worked globally. And if you want to put that into chat, you could just say yes, yes, global, or something. I think John is just trying to get a sense of how many of us actually have that. Thank you, that's brilliant. So you can see there, John, already of the 95, 96 people we've got on the call, the majority are working or have worked globally. And then that brings us to point 4, which is the skills. Developing the cultural intelligence skills of communication, of vision casting, of conflict management, of project execution that comes with this cultural intelligence, the ability to reason and relate and regulate oneself and others in a way that is consistent. Now, having said all of that, one of the things that we want to share with you today is a framework that we call VUCA. I'm going to say nothing more about it other than to ask my colleague Mark to give you 3 or 4 minutes in this video on what we mean by the approach to VUCA positive on the back of what is often seen as VUCA negative. Thanks, Luke.
Hi, I'm Mark Edwards, a Senior Development Coach, and I'm here to help you change your view of the way we deal with the VUCA environment. You probably already know that VUCA stands for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, and it's become a shorthand for the current business climate. But I want to talk to you about a different way we can think about VUCA, which can counteract and take advantage of the era of always-on change. VUCA positive stands for vision, understanding, courage, and agility. Periods of rapid change can be extremely successful for those who manage the stress and the ambiguity of the situation. Some of the world's most successful companies were born in the Great Depression of the 1920s. Warner Brothers, AT&T, Jaguar, American Airlines, Gucci, among many others. These companies were able to harness VUCA positive to see through the horrendous post-war recessions and stock market collapses and take courageous decisions to grow and build organizations that are still around 100 years later. Uncertainty combines with the stress of high-pressure decisions and leads to inaction. Constant change causes stress and reduces our ability to function at a high level. So how can we move from beyond the stress that the VUCA world is putting on all of us, particularly when we are leading organizations? Let's have a look at VUCA positive: vision, understanding, courage, and agility. In a VUCA positive response, leaders must show their confidence in the destination and direction of travel. You need to invite your teams to share in the clear, relatable vision for the business. When you suffer from motion sickness, keeping your eyes on the horizon can settle you down. Helping your team to focus on the goals will help them to get through the messy bit before that. Even if the goal is 100% growth in 3 years, seeing that and seeing that you have a plan to achieve that on a monthly basis reduces the stress and panic, focusing them on getting it done. You'll need to show that you understand what your team is going through. Active listening, empathy, and patience are key here. The further we feel we are from impacting the change, the more we find this change unnerving. Our goal as leaders is to listen, care, and give people a say in how the change will be carried out. We must reassure, not with empty promises that all will be okay, but with authentic care for individuals. You'll need to have courage. To bring a team through change, they have to accept that their comfort zone is gone. You must lead them through the fear zone and into the growth zone. Your example of developing new skills and looking for new opportunities can inspire courage in your team. But you'll need the courage to make hard decisions when you don't have all the data, when you don't know what is right or wrong. You need to have the courage to put aside your own fears so that your team remains engaged and secure in the knowledge that their leaders know what they're doing. And finally, A is for agility. It's the easiest to describe and the hardest to get right. Constantly adapting to what is happening now is exhausting and inconsistent. When I coach leaders, I ask them to look out for the smallest change they can make that will have the biggest impact. This is based on the Pareto effect. Sometimes it's called the 80-20 model. Pareto showed that 20% of work on a project accounts for 80% of the results. 20% of sales account for 80% of income. Making agile decisions to move 20% at a time will make the change not only easier to deal with, but will have a much greater impact. I've been working in organizational and leadership development for nearly 25 years, and believe me, I've had more than my fair share of VUCA. I've come to realize that it's nearly impossible to make accurate business forecasts with any certainty, but our best chance of thriving in this climate is to build VUCA positive into your leadership approach: vision, understanding, courage, and agility.
Thank you very much, Mark. Sharing the vision, making sure the team understands the challenges, having the courage, and being agile. Let's just go back into the deck now and just recap on the VUCA positive and the VUCA negative. So that's the negative. In fact, during COVID, when I launched my book, we actually added an R into this piece, and we went from VUCA to VUCAR, or the R being the recurrency. This idea that, you know, how long will this continue? Not just the volatility and the uncertainty, not just the complexity and the ambiguity, but in a global mindset, being able to navigate all of that and the ongoing recurrent challenges is really important. So that's the VUCA minus. If we go to the VUCA positive, you'll see that Mark reminded us that a global leader is somebody who casts vision, who is clear in their understanding. They're able to show empathy, listening, observing. They take courage, and they have the agility to make adjustments. And the VUCA positive in the framework that I created was where the VUCA minus of recurrency now required the VUCA positive of resilience. So what I want to ask you is, how does a global mindset support, as we stay on this slide, this VUCA positive response? I want to ask you to pick one or more of these competencies and talk to your own context. I noticed that Cedric says supply chain people know a lot about VUCA. Absolutely. But if you were to now think about the VUCA positive, how would a global mindset, having a global mindset, support developing vision, developing understanding, demonstrating courage, and being more agile? What would that look like? I'm going to give you a couple of moments just to type your thoughts into chat, and then we'll pick a couple of them up for discussion. Thanks, Althea. So taking the time, and I think often, Althea, that's the big challenge in this global, fast-paced, really frenetic world in which we work, is we don't have the time to understand where others are coming from, recognizing that, as we often say at Country Navigator, we do not see the world as it is, but as we are. And so seeking to understand rather than to be understood is a great principle. Rampton talks about strong global communication skills, absolutely. And Lee talks about understanding those external factors, both in your control and outside of your control, and how to handle them. I think that's so importantly. So again, recognizing vision as part of a global mindset, understanding, courage, and agility. And John, thank you. Global works locally when applied to diverse value systems. Jessica talks about staying on a positive note and forgiving when someone makes a little mistake. We're all learning, so that talks very much to the psychological safety. Luca talks about global vision and mindset, which helps to have a better understanding and see opportunities rather than a limited angle. I would agree, Luca. We've been working with a large multinational automotive company with hundreds of thousands of employees from many different cultures. And certainly what you've said there is true. Andreas, we support the agility in our global team as everyone can challenge every process we are using in our daily business. So there's that notion of being able to speak with confidence, to challenge. That challenges safety we often talk about. Peter talks about understanding, listening to your counterpart. So very similar to what we heard from Althea. Vincent talks about the global dynamics to set up a sustainable and long-standing vision. I think there will be dynamics. Yes, thank you, Vincent. I was going to ask you about this new leadership principle called dynamics. So global dynamics, brilliant. Stacey, global mindset, supporting understanding and agility through transparent communication. Nancy talks about empathy and personal relationships, and Sneha talks about building trust, a culture of openness, and keeping space to be vulnerable. Really powerful. And you can see that a lot of this links back to what you said in the mural when we spoke about the differences between a local and a global mindset. All that we're doing here is we're giving you a framework, something to hang these principles on. And I would ask you that even if you're familiar with the VUCA model, that you would take some time after this webinar and really go and think about the extent to which in your own leadership context, you're demonstrating that vision, clear understanding, that you're really showing courage through the actions that you take, but at the same time, you're willing to make those adjustments. Julian talks about encouraging courageous leaders. This is a really important topic, and that means where leaders need to be courageous to admit mistakes and still forge ahead among others. And Ruthra talks about the courage to face the leaders and challenge for every new situation. Really powerful. Thank you so much for that. Let's move to the next slide, Luke, as we move into the remaining 20 minutes or so of today's session. And I want to give you a case study. So here in this case study, I'm going to give you a chance to read it, and you can just give me an indication in chat. Just say done or complete or ready once you've read this, and then we can get into some further activity. All right, looks like we've got people saying that they're done, which is fantastic. What I want to ask you is, if you were the coach to Mary, what advice do you have for Mary? What should she do? What do you think would give the biggest impact? Maybe a small change, think about it as a fulcrum. What advice would you have for Mary within her context as a project manager in new tech? Go ahead and give me your thoughts in chat now. So if you were coaching Mary, how would you advise her? Thank you, John. We'll just wait for the others and give them a chance. And just to remind you, if you're wondering about the reference to the shared dimension, if you go back to that polarity that I showed you on shared versus concentrated, what Mary is illustrating here is that she's come out much more on the left, more participative, more collaborative, a stronger preference for that decision-making, which is more shared, and a much flatter hierarchy. So that's where Mary comes out. So John's given us some input, Ramtin's given us some input. And thank you, Ramtin. I think you've picked up on something that may be important there. Althea talks about observing the team and understanding whether she's taken seriously or not, and whether she might need to frame her approach in a different way. Thank you, Josh. Thank you, Catherine. So Catherine talks about the need for greater clarity on the overall strategic plan. Maria talks about giving more context to the global view and strategy, as well as the outcome. And Stacey talks about looking inwards and really understanding their leadership preference. I guess the question is it as simple as saying that Mary needs to adapt and move along that continuum to become more concentrated and more directive in her leadership? Maria makes a good point. Ask them, ask the team how they think the tool could be used so that they could improve. Catherine talks about them being more agile. And Joe makes a great suggestion that Mary might invite the team to share their profiles so that they can really get a picture of what's going on. I think, Joe, we've seen a lot of that. We do have a team profile functionality where you can invite people in, you can do that comparison. I like that idea, Joe, because it might give Mary some insight as to where the balance of her team are sitting on that governance decision-making continuum. Nancy talks about questioning the team on their perception of business continuity, what is their priority, and David talks about sharing more information about her project and providing real context. I think this is excellent. One of the things that I do want to raise at this point is often when we work with leaders who are making the transition from local to global, is they feel that they are going to be challenged with a sense of loss, with having to give up something of who they are, with having to become less of themselves. And what I want to share with you as we move into the back end of this particular webinar, this masterclass, is that there is more than one strategy that you can use to really try and get across what you need to do. And I'm going to ask Luke to go to the next slide, because this is powerful. And I know when I first came across this, it was quite liberating, because I think often when we're trying to bridge the gap between our own leadership style and the style of the people we're working with, there is often that temptation to believe it's all about adaptation. I must simply adjust my behavior to accommodate the other. Now, I think if you are an expat and you are a total of one in a totally different country that works on a completely different way in terms of building relationship or regulating or reasoning, then certainly there's going to be a lot more adaptation required. But the challenge with the adaptation is there's always that underlying suggestion that you and yourself are not enough, that you've got to become less of who you are and more of something else. Now, it can be that adaptation in a global context is required, but it's that accommodation piece that can often imply giving up or giving in or becoming less of. So I have no issue with the adaptation, but the message I want to leave you with is it's certainly not the only approach, the only strategy that you might use when it comes to dealing with these global challenges. It could be that you go for a blend, and let's also not see these as binary. It could be that there's a continuum here. So you might move from adapt to blend. And by blending, Mary would take some of her approach and some of her team's approach. And the best approach then is a mix of, quote, your way and my way. It might even be a more elegant solution to get to the co-creation. What you need there is a high level of trust, a high level of dependency, a high level of acknowledgement that there's merit in the way that the other party or individual works and thinks and manages themselves. And if you have those ingredients, then this ability to co-create is very, very powerful. But again, it may have required adaptation, moving into blending, into co-creation. I think too often there is the shortcut to go straight to the divide. You do you and I will do me, and never the two shall meet, and we'll just carry on almost independent of each other and hope that we can sort of, have a dividing wall between us. I often say to my students, I live in a country in South Africa where we legislated that kind of approach to culture. We called it apartheid, and we lived under that for more than 40 years. And it was a policy of separate development. And I can tell you that it certainly did not leave us any better off. In fact, people were hugely disadvantaged by not being able to integrate in the way that they should have been. Now, you might say, well, you know what, the way that this group of people thinks or reasons or does things is so different. We need to be working alongside them because we need their expertise, or we need their research, or we need their technology, but we're certainly not going to be able to collaborate with them. And I can understand that, but I think when you're working globally, that divide is often a shortcut to something which is less than the optimum. You'll see I've put the enforce in there. Again, we know, if you look at history, there are many examples of colonial powers that have done that, come in and superseded the local culture and enforced a totally new way of thinking and living and working, to the detriment of that indigenous population. But if we think about it in a corporate context, it could be that there are times where there are non-negotiables. I'm thinking of principles of financial regulation. I'm thinking of compliance. I'm thinking of health and safety, where these are not up for discussion. And if you're going to be working in my organization, working in my mine, working in my earth moving equipment department, then this is how it is. If you're working in a bank, there are certain compliance things which just have to be done. So I don't discount the enforcing as a strategy, but again, what you find is that you need quite a long rule book. And if it's not a principle-based enforcement, rather than a compliance-based enforcement, people will always look for reasons and ways to dodge something that's not written in the code of conduct. But let's go back to Mary. If you think about Mary with her shared approach, not necessarily getting the results that she needs, what would your advice be? You've given her advice already, but if you were to now think about bridging the gaps, would you suggest that Mary simply adapts? Would you want her to blend? Would you want her to co-create? Is it a case of you do you, Mary, and the team will do them and they will divide? Or does she go for enforcing? What are your thoughts? Advice to bridge the gaps. Which strategy would you advise Mary to use? I can see overwhelmingly that the people on the call are going for co-creation. Some of you are going for blend and then co-create. And I think you're right. Of course, the co-creation makes some fundamental assumptions about trust, about dependency, about mutuality, about shared goals. And if you have those in place, then I think you can go far, much further, particularly in the global context. But what I want you to understand is that it's not just about giving up all that you are. We've got one participant saying that Mary should enforce, because then Matthew can apply for her job when she loses it. Thank you, Matthew. Yeah, jokes aside, I think clearly there is a real acknowledgement that it's not a case of one size fits all. And Ruth Rapati makes the point that when you have standard operating procedures, it may well be the case that you need to enforce. Okay, so as we move into the remaining 10 minutes or so, let's go now and look at a final whiteboard, a final mural, where we're going to transition from looking at the global mindset into thinking about your experiences. So Luke, if you wouldn't mind just putting that up for us and then sharing your screen, and we're going to take some time for people to give us their contributions into this final link. So this is application time. What can you do to develop your global mindset and work better across cultures? There are 2 questions there. Maybe you want to answer the global mindset on the left and the cultural piece on the right. Maybe you want to answer both questions on one sticky note. I don't mind. By now, I think you know the drill. Double click on the sticky note. It should give you immediate option to type. And I'm going to wait a moment and be quiet while you take a couple of minutes to populate this one for us. So thank you very much for your inputs. There are some profound observations here. The one that I want to pick up on is somebody says, I need to map the unconscious bias. What a profound observation. Of course, the moment you do that, it's moving from the unconscious to the conscious. And building on that, putting myself in the shoes of others, benchmarking best practices without cultural bias, listening and learning before taking action, withholding judgment, leveraging the tool like Country Navigator, attending webinars like this. Thank you so much. And then we've also got people talking about developing that awareness, being more flexible, being more open-minded, thinking out of the box, having an agile mindset. I'm going to give you another minute or so, and then we'll wrap this up in terms of key learnings, and then just give you some post masterclass contact details as well. Two other things which come out from this mural, which are really profound. Somebody says the importance of learning a new language. It would be fascinating to know how many of you speak a second language, and then traveling more. And I'm just so privileged as somebody whose job has taken me to so many different countries. And I think there is no replacement for that. If you're looking to develop the global mindset, is having that complete immersion into cultures that are different to your own is really just so powerful. Thank you very much for that. You can take a couple more moments if you are finishing up, but Luke, if we can swing out of that one, and let's go to our final slide, where here I'm going to just give you a summary of some of the key learnings that we've spoken about. So we can move on to that one. There we go. I think firstly, context matters. Understanding that your view of the world is not necessarily the view that others have, and the context within that which they're working might be quite different. Often if you're tasked with overarching global priorities and you're getting people to execute those within a local context, it can be really challenging. And we've seen that with our work in many of the countries and companies we work with, is there's that disconnect very often between what is being required from head office versus the real day-to-day nuances and obstacles that are happening within that local context. So being context sensitive. Now, how do you do that? Simple. If you're on a call and it's morning and you're on a Teams meeting or a Zoom call with other people around the world, recognizing that they're not necessarily all going to be on the call at the same time. It may be afternoon, it may be evening. I've had a couple of emails the last couple of days saying to me, really hope you're going to be enjoying your summer. And I'm sitting here in the middle of winter freezing. And these are just some examples of context sensitivity, which can demonstrate the fact that you're seeing beyond the immediacy of your world. And then the curious. I remember many years ago when I started working in Country Navigator, one of the principles that we learned was learning to be curious rather than furious. It's too easy to get mad with people who might relate and regulate and reason in a way that is different to what you're used to. When they make decisions or present arguments or write reports in a way that is alien to you, instead of getting frustrated about it, take an approach that says, help me understand. Let me learn about your culture, about your way of life, about your perspective on this particular topic. And then I think certainly the business case for diversity has been made. And if you're serious about the global mindset and you're serious about moving from inclusion to diversity and to develop cultural intelligence, then you will recognize that working in a homogeneous team certainly is one way of working, But when you work in a heterogeneous team where people are different in terms of age and gender and nationality and worldview, the opportunity for creativity and innovation goes up exponentially. Think before moving, think before acting. Understand and ask yourselves, what are the consequences of me saying this? What are the consequences of me not saying this? And really being much more mindful of your action and of your inaction. And then I think finally, this is all about humility. Too often we can assume that we've made it, that we've got this waxed, that we know how this works, and we go into a new environment with a copy and paste approach, only to realize very quickly that that doesn't work. And I've worked with too many leaders, coach them around this thing, that often we can be, we can be the victims of our own success, because what's worked in other contexts, in other geographies, might not necessarily translate into this context. So that's where I want to leave it. I really want to thank you for this hour that we've had together. If you have any questions or comments, you need support, you want to find out more about Country Navigator or about the World Prism, I'm going to ask Luke to drop an email address into chat that will enable you to get hold of support@countrynavigator.com. We'd love to be in touch with you and share with you some of our successes that we've had with companies around the world in helping them and their leaders develop a global mindset. For the final time today, thank you for joining me. I wish you well. Bye-bye.